At 8:03 a.m. on June 16, 1943, Captain J. Zemer held his B-17 rock steady at 25,000 feet above Buka Island as 16 Japanese Zero fighters clawed upward from the airstrip below. The young pilot was just 24 years old. 3 months earlier, he had pulled this bomber out of the boneyard and rebuilt it with a crew no one else wanted. Now, that decision had led them to the most dangerous volunteer mission of their lives. This was a solo, 1,200-mile photographic reconnaissance flight, an assignment headquarters had openly described as suicidal. Over the previous 6 months, the Pacific Theater had lost 43 unescorted bombers over Japanese-held territory. Fewer than 30% of their crews survived. That morning, the aircraft known as Old 666 carried 9 men into the sky. Zemer's crew called themselves the Eager Beavers because they volunteered for missions others refused. They had taken a battered B-17E that many pilots believed was cursed, stripped out 2,000 pounds of unnecessary weight, installed new engines, and mounted 19 .50 caliber machine guns. The result was a bomber with more firepower than any other aircraft operating in the Pacific. But firepower meant little against the odds now rising to meet them. 16 Japanese fighters were climbing at 3,000 feet per minute. The photomapping run required Old 666 to hold its course for 2 more minutes. No evasive action, no deviation. 9 Americans hung suspended in hostile airspace, hundreds of miles from friendly cover. Second Lieutenant Joseph Sarnosky crouched in the nose at the bombardier's position. At 28, he had already spent 18 months flying combat missions in the Pacific. 3 weeks earlier, he had earned the Silver Star. His orders sending him home would take effect in just 3 days. His duffel bag was already packed at Port Moresby. He volunteered anyway. The crew needed an experienced bombardier to operate the cameras, and Sarnosky stepped forward. Now he checked the twin .50 caliber guns mounted in the nose. The fixed forward-firing gun Zemer could trigger from the cockpit was armed and ready. 16 fighters, 1 bomber. The mission had begun at 4 a.m. when Old 666 lifted off from Port Moresby, New Guinea. The Marines required detailed photographs of Bougainville's western coastline in preparation for a November invasion. Precise mapping images of Empress Augusta Bay were essential. But intelligence added a last-minute demand. Photograph Buka airfield first. The small island showed signs of increased Japanese activity. 1 bomber. No escort. The P-38s lacked the range. When Old 666 reached Bougainville earlier that morning, it arrived too soon. The sun was still too low for proper mapping photography. Now, over Buka, the light was right, and the enemy was climbing fast. They made the decision quickly. Either wait over open water or press on and photograph Buka before the fighters reached them. The Zeros were already climbing past 24,000 feet, just 1,000 feet below. There was no time left to hesitate. The first 5 fighters peeled away from the formation and fanned out for a frontal attack. Most B-17s carried little to no nose armament. Old 666 was different. She carried .50 caliber guns in the nose, far more than the Japanese pilots expected. They didn't know that yet. Could a single bomber survive 16 fighters deep over enemy territory? Back to Zemer. The Zeros rolled into their dives. Zemer kept the aircraft rock steady. The cameras were still running. 30 seconds remained. The fighters screamed in at nearly 700 miles per hour. At 600 yards, they opened fire. Sarnosky answered instantly. His twin .50s thundered. Zemer triggered the fixed nose gun from the cockpit. 3 streams of fire converged on the lead Zero. Its engine erupted in flame. The fighter flipped inverted and dropped away. The remaining 4 pressed in. At 300 yards, cannon shells tore into the nose. Plexiglass shattered outward. 1 round detonated directly in front of Sarnosky. The blast hurled him backward. Blood poured from his neck and side. In the cockpit, shells ripped through the floor. Pain exploded in Zemer's left leg as shrapnel ripped into both legs and his wrist. The Zeros flashed past. 12 seconds. 1 enemy fighter damaged. 1 bombardier dying. 1 pilot wounded. 15 fighters still climbing. Hundreds of miles from safety. Navigator First Lieutenant Robert Ruby Johnston crawled forward from his station. He found Sarnosky collapsed beneath the catwalk, blood pooling across the metal floor. The wound in the bombardier's neck pulsed red with every heartbeat. Johnston pressed his hand against it, trying to stem the flow. Sarnowski shoved him away. He pointed toward the nose. Another attack was coming. Johnston looked up through the shattered plexiglass. 8 more Zeros were diving from 26,000 feet. They had watched the first assault, learned from it. This time, they weren't coming 5 abreast. They were coming in 2 waves. 4 from above, 4 from below. A bracket attack. Sarnowski dragged himself back into position. His flight suit was soaked through. He wrapped his hands around the twin. 50 caliber grips. His arms trembled. His vision swam. He blinked hard and forced focus. The lead Zero filled the sight. 600 yards. 500. 400. He fired. The twin guns roared. Tracers stitched up the fighter's nose. The canopy burst apart in a spray of glass and aluminum. The Zero rolled right and plunged downward, trailing smoke. Sarnowski swung to the next target and fired again. Rounds tore through the engine cowling. The propeller froze. The aircraft dropped out of the sky. In the cockpit, Zimmer fought the controls. His left rudder pedal was gone, obliterated by a 20mm hit. Blood filled his boot. The leg wound was deep, bone visible through torn fabric. Shrapnel had sliced his right wrist. His fingers were numb. The control yoke was slick with blood. Still, he held course. The cameras continued to run. The mapping photographs of Empress Augusta Bay were essential. The Marines needed them. Without these images, the November invasion would go in blind. Men would land on beaches they had never truly seen. Zimmer did not move. Below, 4 Zeros climbed in from 19,000 feet. Ball turret gunner staff Sergeant Forrest Dilley tracked them through his sight. The turret hung beneath the bomber's fuselage, a cramped sphere of steel and plexiglass. Dilley was small enough to fit, curled into the rotating ball as the fighters closed in. He had been manning the ball turret for 6 months. 32 missions behind him, and nothing had prepared him for this. For fighters were climbing straight up from below, exploiting the one direction most bombers could not defend. Most bombers, but not old 666. Dilley opened fire at 400 yards. His twin, 50 caliber guns thundered. The lead Zero pulled sharply upward, trying to escape the arc of fire. The tracers followed, climbing along the fighter's belly. A moment later, the fuel tank detonated. An orange fireball blossomed at 18,000 feet. The remaining 3 fighters scattered in all directions. The photomapping run was complete. Zimmer rolled the bomber left and turned southwest, setting course for Bougainville's western coastline, the mission's primary objective. 13 Japanese fighters were still airborne, regrouping above them. In the nose, Sarnowski slumped forward over the guns. Navigator Johnston crawled back and checked for a pulse. There was none. The bombardier had continued fighting for 4 minutes after receiving a fatal wound. Now his heart had finally stopped. Johnston pulled the body away from the guns and took his place. Old 666 needed every weapon still firing. In the cockpit, oxygen pressure gauges dropped to 0. The yellow oxygen tanks mounted behind the cockpit had exploded when the 20mm shells tore through the fuselage. From that moment on, every crew member depended on small, personal oxygen bottles. At 25,000 feet, those bottles would last maybe 10 minutes. After that came hypoxia, confusion, loss of coordination, unconsciousness, and death. Zimmer faced a decision. He could descend below 10,000 feet where the crew could breathe, or stay high and risk blacking out. He chose to descend, but not yet. The cameras still needed 3 more minutes to complete the Bougainville coastal photography. 3 minutes at altitude without oxygen. The co-pilot, Second Lieutenant John Britton, stirred. He had been knocked unconscious when the first shell tore through the cockpit. Blood streaked down the back of his head from a deep contusion. As his vision cleared, he looked at Zimmer's left leg. The knee was shattered, broken above and below. A hole the size of a fist gaped in the thigh. White bone fragments protruded through torn muscle and flight suit. Zimmer's hands were locked around the control yoke, knuckles bleached white. His face had gone gray from blood loss. Britton reached for the controls. Zimmer shook his head. Not yet. Hold course. 2 more minutes. Above them, the remaining 13 Zeros regrouped at 27,000 feet, 2,000 feet higher than old 666. They had lost 3 aircraft and damaged 2 more against a single bomber. This American aircraft carried far more firepower than their intelligence had indicated. The Japanese flight leader adjusted his plan. There would be no more frontal attacks against that nose armament. The Japanese flight leader shifted tactics. No more head-on attacks. Instead, they would come from the sides, from the waist positions. Most B-17s in the Pacific carried only a single gun on each side, leaving wide blind spots and vulnerable crews. He did not know Old 666 carried twin, 50 caliber guns in both waist positions. Staff Sergeant George Kendrick manned the right waist. Sergeant Herbert Pugh observed from the left. Both men watched the fighters assemble, counting silently as the formation took shape. 13, 6 coming from the right, 7 from the left. A split attack, designed to overload the gunners and overwhelm one side before the other could react. Kendrick and Pugh had flown together for 8 months. They didn't need to talk. The plan was automatic. Kendrick would handle the right. Pugh would cover the left. If targets crossed through the fuselage, they would hand them off instinctively. The Zeros rolled into their dives. Kendrick opened fire at 500 yards. His twin, 50s locked onto the lead fighter on the right. Tracers converged. The Zero's wing root erupted as fuel sprayed into the slipstream. The aircraft rolled away, trailing fire. Kendrick shifted immediately to the next attacker. He fired, missed. The Zero juked violently, throwing off his aim. Kendrick adjusted his lead and fired again. Rounds walked across the fuselage. The cockpit glass exploded. The fighter snap-rolled left and fell out of control. 2 down on the right. For still coming. On the left side, Pugh faced 7 attackers. The first Zero came in fast, too fast. Pugh held his fire, tracking steadily. The Zero's guns flashed. Rounds punched through Old 660 SIXS fuselage. Pugh didn't flinch. At 300 yards, he squeezed the triggers. The Zero flew straight through his stream of fire. Smoke poured from the engine as it clawed upward and vanished above the bomber. Inside the aircraft, the cameras shut off. Mapping complete. Zemer shoved the control yoke forward. Old 660 SIXS nose dropped sharply. The altimeter unwound. 24,000, 22,000, 20,000 feet. The dive was steep, violent, and necessary. The crew needed breathable air. The Zeros followed, diving after them. At 15,000 feet, Zemer eased back and leveled off. Air rushed into lungs. Crewmen gasped, sucking in oxygen as their bodies clawed back from the edge. Their personal bottles had run dry minutes earlier. Some had been seconds from losing consciousness. The dive had saved them. Radio operator Technical Sergeant Johnny Abel crawled out of the top turret. Blood soaked his left leg. Shrapnel from the exploded oxygen tanks had torn into his thigh. He ignored it and moved through the aircraft, checking positions. The waist gunners were still fighting. The tail gunner was alive. The ball turret was operational. Navigator Johnston was now on the nose guns. Sarnowski's body lay beneath the catwalk, covered with a jacket. Abel climbed back into the top turret and swung the twin 50s toward the pursuing Zeros. They came again. Now the Japanese fighters held the advantage. Old 666 was down at 15,000 feet. Lower, slower, no longer able to rely on altitude. The Zeros could dive from above with superior speed. 8 fighters remained fully operational. 5 had been destroyed or damaged, but 8 was still more than enough. The flight leader split them into 2 4-plane elements. One group would attack from the rear quarter. The other would strike from the forward quarter. The goal was simple: force the bomber to defend 2 directions at once. A classic pincer. It usually worked. Tail Gunner Staff Sergeant William Vaughn saw the rear element first. 4 Zeros in trail formation, diving from high 6 o'clock. They would slash through the tail, then pull up and away before the nose guns could engage. Vaughn had seen the maneuver dozens of times. He elevated his twin 50s to their maximum angle and waited. The Zeros opened fire at 600 yards. Too far. Their rounds fell short. Vaughn didn't answer. He conserved ammunition. 500 yards. 400. Now they were committed. Breaking off would mean exposing their bellies. Vaughn fired. Both 50s roared. The lead Zero took multiple hits across the engine. Smoke burst from the cowling. The fighter pitched upward, stalled, and fell away in a slow, spiraling dive. The other 3 scattered immediately, breaking formation. At the same moment, the forward element attacked. For Zero's dove toward the nose from 10 o'clock high. Johnston spotted them and swung Sarnowski's guns into position. The barrels were still hot from the previous engagement, ammunition feeds intact. He fired at 500 yards. Tracers streaked forward, missed. The lead Zero was closing fast, nearly 400 miles per hour. Johnston adjusted his lead and fired again. This time the rounds hit. The Zero's cowling disintegrated. Fragments tore back into the canopy. The fighter pulled up trailing smoke and vanished upward. Old 666 shuddered as enemy rounds found their mark. 20mm shells punched through the left wing. Hydraulic fluid sprayed into the slipstream. The No. 2 engine sputtered, coughed, then began to run rough. Zemer glanced at the gauges. Oil pressure was falling. Cylinder head temperature climbed rapidly. The engine was failing. He feathered the propeller and shut it down. 3 engines left. Hundreds of miles still to fly. At 8:45 a.m., 42 minutes after the first attack, the Japanese fighters finally disengaged. They had lost 4 aircraft outright, with 3 more badly damaged. Ammunition was nearly gone. Fuel gauges were critical. Bucha lay 30 minutes away. They could not continue the fight. The flight leader rocked his wings, the signal to break off. 7 remaining Zeros turned northeast, climbed away, and disappeared. Old 666 limped southwest alone over open ocean. Zemer sagged back in his seat. The adrenaline drained away, replaced instantly by pain. His left leg throbbed violently. Each heartbeat sent waves of agony through the shattered knee. Blood flowed steadily from his right wrist, the cut deep enough to expose tendon. His flight suit was soaked from waist to boots. Blood pooled on the cockpit floor, mixing with hydraulic fluid and spent brass. The air stank of copper, cordite, and aviation fuel. Britain eased into the controls. This time, Zemer did not resist. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and stayed conscious by sheer force of will. Behind the cockpit, the crew took stock. Old 666 had absorbed 187 bullet holes and 5 direct hits from 20mm cannon. The nose plexiglass was gone entirely, leaving a screaming hole where wind tore through the fuselage. The oxygen system was destroyed. The No. 2 engine was dead. Hydraulic lines leaked. The radio had been knocked out during the first attack. They could not call for help. They could not request emergency clearance. They were alone. They were completely on their own. Port Moresby lay 500 miles to the southwest, nearly 2 hours of flying time at reduced speed on only 3 engines. In the cockpit, Abel and Kendrick worked over Zemer's shattered leg. They tore the first aid kit from its mount, found sulfa powder and bandages, and did what little they could. The wound was far beyond field treatment. The bone was splintered. Major vessels had been severed. They packed the leg with gauze, wrapped it tight, applied steady pressure, and slowed the bleeding. It was all they could manage. Zemer needed a surgeon, quickly, or he would bleed out long before reaching land. His pulse was faint. His skin had gone ashen. His lips were turning blue. Shock was taking hold. In the nose, Johnston stayed at the guns, eyes locked on the sky. The Japanese could still send another wave. Fresh fighters from Rabaul could reach this airspace in 90 minutes. Old 666 would be exposed the entire way back. No radio, 1 engine dead, wounded crew, barely holding together. But the fighters never came. The sky remained empty. Only cloud and ocean rolled beneath them as the bomber droned southwest, alone. At 9:30 a.m., Britain spotted the coastline of New Guinea. They had crossed the Solomon Sea. But Port Moresby was still 200 miles inland, over mountains, through unpredictable weather. Old 666 was losing altitude. 3 engines could no longer hold 15,000 feet. The altimeter unwound to 12,000, still sinking. Ahead, the mountains rose to 7,000 feet. They cleared them, barely. Zemer opened his eyes. He didn't remember closing them. Britain was still flying. The coast had slipped behind them. Dense jungle stretched below. The Owen Stanley Range loomed ahead, 7,000 feet of rock and forest between them and home. Zemer checked the altimeter. 11,500 feet. Dropping. He glanced at the engine instruments. No. 2 remained feathered, dead. No. 1 was overheating. Cylinder head temperature was deep in the red. Oil pressure fluctuated erratically. That engine was failing. If it quit, they would be down to 2 engines. 2 engines would not clear the mountains. They would have to ditch in the jungle. No one survived jungle crashes. At 10,000 feet, the weather closed in. Thick clouds swallowed the bomber. Visibility vanished. Britain switched fully to instruments: compass heading, airspeed, altitude, rate of descent. The aircraft shuddered violently as turbulence battered the airframe. Rain hammered the fuselage. Lightning split the clouds. Thunder rolled around them. Old 666 descended through 9,000 feet. The mountains were somewhere ahead, hidden inside the clouds. Britain couldn't see them. He flew the heading anyway, eyes locked on the instruments, faith placed in the compass, hoping the peaks were already behind them. At 9,500 feet, the bomber burst out of the cloud layer. Clear air, and mountains everywhere. The Owen Stanley Range rose around them, steep, jagged ridgelines buried in thick jungle. Old 666 sat trapped inside a valley, peaks towering higher on both sides. Britain banked right, following the valley's curve southwest, searching desperately for a passage through the range. The altimeter ticked down. 9,000 feet. Still descending. Number 1 engine was failing fast. The temperature needle was pinned. The engine was overheating, tearing itself apart. Britain eased the power back, nursing it, trying to keep it alive just a little longer. They needed every ounce of thrust. Kendrick crawled forward and spoke quietly to Britain. Zeamer was unconscious. His pulse was barely there. His breathing shallow and irregular. Too much blood had been lost. Hours had passed since the wound. The bandages were soaked through completely. There was nothing more the crew could do. Zeamer needed transfusions. Surgery. Minutes mattered now. Britain pushed the throttles forward. Caution no longer mattered. Speed did. The valley widened ahead. Beyond the next ridge lay Port Moresby, 30 miles away. Britain aimed for the lowest saddle between peaks and began the climb. 8,000 feet. Old 666 clawed upward at 700 feet per minute. Normally, she could manage 1,000. Now she was at the edge of her ability. The ridge rushed toward them. They cleared it by 300 feet. Treetops flashed beneath the fuselage. Then the valley opened. Port Moresby lay ahead. Home. Britain reached for the radio. Dead. Still dead. No call to the tower. No emergency clearance. No warning. He would have to take the runway as it was and trust that someone on the ground saw them coming. Saw the damage. Understood the urgency. Landing gear down. The hydraulics groaned but responded. The wheels locked into place. Flaps next. They extended only partially. Pressure was too low for full deployment. The approach would be fast, dangerously fast. There was no alternative. Old 666 crossed the airfield boundary at 140 miles per hour, 32 fast. Britain held the nose up, bleeding speed. The main wheels struck the runway, bounced, hit again, and stayed down. He reversed the propellers and stood on the brakes. The bomber thundered down the strip. 2,000 feet left. 1,000. 500. Old 666 rolled to a stop with 200 feet of runway remaining. Britain shut down the engines. The propellers slowed, windmilled, then stopped. Silence fell. After 8 hours of engine roar, gunfire, and wind screaming through the shattered nose, the quiet felt unreal, almost painful. Ground crews sprinted toward the bomber. They had seen the approach, seen the missing plexiglass, the feathered engine, the aircraft riddled with holes. They knew it was bad. The crew door opened. Abel climbed out first, then Kendrick, then Pugh, then Vaughn, then Dilly, then Johnston. 6 men, bloodied, exhausted, barely standing, but alive. The ground crew chief climbed aboard, took one look inside, and froze. Blood pooled across the cockpit floor. Zeamer slumped motionless in the pilot's seat. Beneath the catwalk in the nose lay a body covered with a jacket. He climbed back down and spoke quickly to the medics waiting below. Get the pilot last. He's dead. The medics lifted Zeamer onto a stretcher. His face was gray. His lips were blue. He didn't move. Britain jumped down behind them and grabbed the lead medic's arm. The pilot's not dead, he said. Check him. The medic stopped. Set the stretcher down. Felt for a pulse. There was one. Weak. Thread-like. Barely there, but alive. They ran. Zeamer was loaded into an ambulance and rushed toward the field hospital, wheels throwing up dust as it sped away. Doctors gave him 1 chance in 10, maybe less. He had lost more than half his blood volume. Both legs were shattered. The left knee was destroyed, fractured above and below. Tendons in his right wrist were severed. Dozens of shrapnel wounds covered his arms and torso. He was in profound shock. His body temperature had dropped to 94 degrees. They began transfusions immediately. For units. 6. 8. Surgery followed, 6 straight hours in the operating room. Surgeons rebuilt the knee, repaired severed arteries, and fought to keep him alive. They succeeded. Johnston led the ground crew back to the aircraft, back to Sarnoski's body, still inside Old 666, where the bombardier had fought until his heart finally gave out. They lifted him out gently, with care and quiet respect. Sarnoski's body was placed onto a stretcher and covered with a clean sheet. The bombardier had died at his guns, kept fighting after a wound that should have killed him instantly. Even after his neck was torn open and his side ripped apart, he had dragged himself back into position and continued firing until his heart finally stopped. He had shot down 2 Zeros after the blast that should have ended his life. He saved the mission. He saved the crew. He held the nose of the aircraft while he was dying. In 3 days, he was supposed to go home, back to Pennsylvania, back to his wife Marie, back to a family that included 17 siblings. Instead, he would return in a coffin. A hero. And gone. Outside, the ground crew chief walked slowly around Old 666, counting the damage piece by piece. 187 bullet holes. 5 direct hits from 20mm cannon, each one capable of destroying a fighter. The nose completely destroyed. Oxygen system gone. Radio destroyed. Number 2 engine dead. Hydraulics shredded. Flight controls damaged. Left wing spar cracked. Tail section riddled with holes. He stopped and looked at the surviving crew. "How many fighters attacked you?" he asked. Britain answered quietly. 16. Maybe 17. They came in waves. The crew chief shook his head. He didn't believe it. No bomber survived 16 fighters alone. It wasn't possible. Then he climbed inside. He saw the blood coating nearly every surface. He saw thousands of spent brass casings scattered across the floor. Torn metal. Shattered instruments. Destroyed systems. The evidence of sustained combat everywhere he looked. Only then did he believe it. In 18 months in the Pacific Theater, he had never seen a bomber absorb this kind of punishment and still return. The photographs Old 666 brought back were developed within hours. Intelligence officers studied them carefully. The images of Buka Airfield showed 16 aircraft on the ground, clear confirmation of the Japanese buildup. The Bougainville coastal mapping photographs were flawless. Every reef, every beach, every approach to Empress Augusta Bay was visible in precise detail. They were exactly what the Marines needed. On November 1, 1943, 4 months after Zemer's mission, the 3rd Marine Division landed at Empress Augusta Bay. They planned the operation using those photographs. Landing zones, approach routes, defensive positions. The invasion succeeded. Bougainville was secured. The images captured by a dying bombardier and a bleeding pilot saved hundreds of lives, perhaps thousands. Zemer spent 15 months in hospitals. 7 surgeries on his left leg, 3 on his right wrist. A year of physical therapy. He learned to walk again slowly, painfully. The knee never fully healed. He walked with a limp for the rest of his life, but he lived. On January 16, 1944, 7 months after the mission, General Henry Hap Arnold presented Zemer with the Medal of Honor at Walter Reed Hospital. Zemer was still in a wheelchair, still recovering. His parents stood beside him. His mother wept. His father saluted. 2 weeks earlier, on December 17, 1943, Sarnoski had been awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. His widow, Marie, received it in Pennsylvania. She held the medal for a moment, then handed it to Sarnoski's parents. They placed it in a glass case beside his Silver Star, his Air Medal, and a photograph of their son in his bombardier's uniform, smiling, alive. The remaining 7 crew members received the Distinguished Service Cross, second only to the Medal of Honor. Britton, Johnston, Abel, Kendrick, Pugh, Vaughan, Dilley, all 7. It remains the most highly decorated single-air mission in American history. 9 men, 2 Medals of Honor, 7 Distinguished Service Crosses, 5 Purple Hearts. No other crew has ever been honored like it. Not before, not since. Old 666 was repaired and returned to service. She flew 18 more missions before being retired in March 1944. She was sent back to the United States, used as a training aircraft, and finally scrapped in August 1945. The nose plexiglass was never fully restored. Crews who flew her later said they could still see patched bullet holes and still see bloodstains on the floor. The bomber had become a legend. Ziemer survived the war. He returned to MIT, earned a master's degree in aeronautical engineering, worked in the aerospace industry for 3 decades, married, raised children, and eventually retired to Boothbay Harbor, Maine, the place where he had spent summers as a boy building boats and sailing. He died on March 22, 2007, at the age of 88. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. Section 34. Grave 809.